From the time of Abraham until today, anti-Semitism has been in this world. Abraham and Sarah, elderly, called to do something miraculous by having a child and founding a new land and a new nation, would be fiercely opposed right from the beginning. 4 kings go against Abraham, and he conquers them, defeats them, and on his way back from that victory, a mysterious priest comes forward. The priest Melchizedek, priest of God Most High, and he offers bread and wine in thanksgiving for the accomplishment of God in Abraham. All hell was disturbed because now there was a person and persons that were worshiping the one true transcendent God and not chasing after countless deities and not being steeped in paganism. This priest of God Most High and Abraham were on to something revolutionary. Ordained according to the order of Melchizedek, I offer bread and wine, and a bread and wine that is more than simply bread and wine. And I offer it in thanksgiving to the loving God, our Father, who helps us triumph over evil. All of us are on this great journey. But we see the whole history of the Hebrew literature, attack after attack after attack on the descendants of Abraham. Eventually they're enslaved in Egypt, but Moses is sent to set them free. And not only free from the Egyptians, but free from that power of hell that would teach people to live only for themselves. He gave the Israelites and humanity the 10 Commandments to show us there is a right and there is a wrong. What a revolution that was. Hell couldn't stand for that. And so there would be attack after attack on the people of God. Eventually, when they settled in the Promised Land, they would find that they would need prophetic voices raised in their midst to remind them of what was godly. And in the prophets of Israel, we hear about taking care of the weak, the widow, the orphan, the stranger in the land, and also keeping holy the Lord's Day. That was the will of God. This was a revolution in human consciousness and goes directly against the values of hell, which tells us, live for yourself and let everyone else go to hell. There was a spiritual revolution. Many accept the notion that taking care of the weak, the widow, the orphan, the stranger are good ideas, but then they balk at the idea of keeping holy the Lord's Day, spending any time with God, resting with God. Do it on your own. And they soon find out that that does not work out in the long run. The enemies of Israel, the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all attacked Israel from multiple directions. And they almost succeeded. The Neo-Assyrians wiped out the 10 northern tribes of Israel and they disappeared from history. But Babylon, when it conquered Jerusalem, as Jeremiah predicted they would, the people went into exile with the faith and love of God written on their hearts and in their minds and on the scrolls that were so precious to them, teaching them about their sacred history, so that when a benevolent Persian king destroyed Babylon, they came back rejoicing to live their faith in freedom. But the area was conquered over and over by a variety of empires. Alexander the Great conquered from Macedonia through Greece all the way down to Egypt, and he moved conquering across the Mideast and northern India before eventually he dies at age 33. And his empire breaks up into 4 segments. The Ptolemies first ruled Judea and Galilee, and they were replaced by the Seleucid Empire. And that emperor decided he wanted everyone to worship his God and look upon him as a god himself. And they put up a pagan image in the temple, forcing everybody to eat non-kosher food. And in the books of Maccabees, we see a tremendous revolt by the people against that empire that eventually won. When the Romans came through that area, they had a genius for not only military conquest, but political astuteness of how to rule the various people they had conquered. They heard about what happened with the Seleucids. They negotiated with the Jews, who said, we cannot offer sacrifice to an emperor, we can't worship your gods, but we will pray for the emperor. We'll pray for the emperor's health, the well-being, and the success of the empire. And the Romans said, that is good enough for us. And the Romans promised not to bring their images into Jerusalem. The legions would not carry their eagles on their standards into that city. They didn't want to invoke and provoke riots for no good reason. At the time of Jesus, we see how the area was governed with vassal kings like Herod the Great and the other Herods, by governors and procurators, and by high priests who were appointed with the approval of Rome. They would only approve high priests that were smart enough to get along with the Roman authorities and not to provoke any types of rebellion. At the trial of Jesus, we see Caiaphas saying, the nation is on the verge of revolt. If that happens, the Romans will come and destroy us. And he was absolutely right. Because in the year 70, there was a revolt. And at first it succeeded. The Romans bid their time well, and they came back with a vengeance, destroying everything in sight, carrying off the treasures of the temple, enslaving the people and bringing them to Rome. And many of them worked on building the great and heinous Colosseum for the pleasure of the Roman citizens, of a sport that involved slaughter of human beings, slaughter of criminals, and the random destruction of a wide variety of animals, built by slaves from Judea. The Jews had to keep a low profile after that. They had to be cautious not to provoke the ire and wrath of Rome in any of their local communities. But again, in the year 130, 135, a tremendous revolt started in Judea, drove the Romans out temporarily, and the Romans came back with a vengeance, destroying everything in sight. And they were so upset, they struck the word Judea out of the Latin language and named the area Palestine. After that, the Jews had to be especially cautious. Simon Bar Kokhba, the son of a star, was then known as the son of a lie because he had broken the hearts and the spirits of so many people that had placed their faith in him. Christianity at the same period had to have a very low profile because the Christians were accused of atheists. They wouldn't worship the emperor. They wouldn't worship at the pagan temples. They were accused of being haters of humanity because they wouldn't participate in the orgies around those temples or go to the temple prostitutes. They were considered haters of humanity because by them not attending, the gods and goddesses would get mad and punish the cities. And plus there were rumors about the Christians being involved in all types of rites and rituals involving bread and blood and human sacrifice. Pliny the Younger tortured a number of Christians, and they only manifested being decent human beings. Pliny wrote to the emperor, said, well, nothing that I could find they're doing wrong, but their sheer stubbornness deserves capital punishment. One of the great tragic ironies of history is that first Christianity becomes a legal religion. Hooray, what a relief. After so many killed, maimed, slaughtered, imprisoned. The emperor wants to know what Christianity is about. He calls a council at Nicaea, and the bishops say, we believe Jesus is true God and true man, clearly distinguishing it from Judaism. But then members of the royal family were converted by Arian to his perception that Jesus was the best creature ever, but not God. So the emperor throws out all the Orthodox bishops and puts in Arian bishops. Now, this type of struggle will go on and on and on, where the emperors, kings, and rulers would try to control the church, and the church, unfortunately, would try to control the kings and emperors in the political process. A battle royal. In the struggles between church and state, we would see what they called lay investiture, where the emperors would pick who the bishops were, who would be political cronies. This accelerated the moral corruption of the church. And the church in turn was rewarded, sometimes financially, sometimes the church properties would be confiscated. But it was a very difficult time because the only political theory people could come up with was that the emperor, king, local rulers got their authority directly from God, and the church's job was to make certain everybody was worshiping God the same way. Hence came the Inquisitions, the religious persecutions. In the early 11th, 12th century, this rumor started that the Jews would kill around Passover a Christian child and mix the blood of the child with the bread at the Passover meal. Ironically, the exact same notion that the Romans had against the first century Christians. It was totally untrue. It's hard to believe anybody took it seriously, but almost everybody did. And you'll see some ancient engraving showing the Jews sacrificing a Christian child. In the great Gothic cathedrals, with all of their beauty, their majesty, you'll see in many of the entrances an image of the church as a strong, beautiful woman holding the chalice, holding the scriptures, upright and strong and vibrant. On the opposite side, you'll see an image of the synagogue, a woman broken, blindfolded, sometimes blindfolded with a snake, the 10 Commandments slipping from her hands, her staff shattered. The church had replaced the people of God. And why don't those Jews just disappear and go away already? A tremendous amount of persecutions, many times local, around Good Friday would break out across Europe, depending on the preaching of the pastor. If he really gave fire and brimstone, stressing that the perfidious Jews had killed Christ, there would be riots throughout the city against the Jews. A terrible time of religious darkness on one hand, and great religious enlightenment on the other hand. The Jews suffering from anti-Semitism. You would think, okay, well that's ancient history, that's medieval history. Well, the last trial of the blood right of Jews happened in 1913 in Kiev, Russia. A 14-year-old boy was found in a cave murdered, stabbed about 13 or 14 times. The local coroner, who was an anti-Semitic, said this is definitely a ritual killing of the Jews of this boy. They needed the blood for their Passover meals. So they arrested a Jew who was not even particularly religious. He was going to be the scapegoat. Fortunately, he got together a good legal team, 4 lawyers, only one of which was Jewish, but they were all very sharp. But they knew they had an uphill battle. They looked at the jurors, and they were 12 peasants. And they said amongst themselves, these are the most ignorant, uneducated people that the Tsar and his team could have possibly found. How could we convince them of anything? The prosecutors brought in a star witness as a woman who was actually the leader of a criminal family. And she probably was the one that actually was involved in the murder of that 14-year-old, who perhaps unintentionally stumbled across her operations. And they brought in a priest who proclaimed that he was an expert in Hebrew and Judaism, that he had studied the entire Talmud. And he summarized the Talmud by saying, well, in the Talmud, it said that you're allowed to lie to Gentiles, cheat Gentiles, attack Gentiles, and murder Gentiles. And on top of that, there was this ritual murder of Christian children endorsed there. And unfortunately, to this very day on the internet, you'll find articles, videos asserting this. People that don't realize the Talmud's 9,000 or 10,000 pages long, and none of those things are in the Talmud. The defense attorneys cross-examined him, and by the time the cross was finished, everybody in the courtroom knew he didn't know anything about Hebrew, didn't know anything about the Talmud, and was basically an ignoramus. But it was an ignoramus of really terrible power over the human imagination. Much to the defense attorney's delight, the 12 ignoramus peasants, they declared the Jew innocent. They said there was absolutely no evidence that he committed this murder. They did say, however, well, if the coroner says it was a ritual murder, well, it's a ritual murder, but we don't think this man did it. So his life was spared. But that wasn't the end of the story. During World War II, Himmler sent transcripts redacted of this trial to all of his SS units that were involved in rounding up and slaughtering Jews, men, women, and children, so they could think of these people killing innocent Christian children. They could slay these Jews and prevent that from happening in the future. When the Holocaust comes in mid-20th century, there had been religious bigotry, religious anti-Semitism for centuries on end. But if a person converted to Christianity, they were embraced by the Christian community and accepted as one of their own. In 1492, the King and Queen of Spain, they said to the Jews, convert to Christianity, you're welcome to stay here, if not, get out. And most of them got out under horrible circumstances, terrible suffering. But now something new had happened. Racially, you're a Jew, and nothing could change that. Hitler in Mein Kampf clearly states that he didn't care if a person was converted to Christianity. A few drops of water on the head wouldn't make the person anything other than a Jew. And the Jews would be laughing up their sleeves at the naivete of the Aryans who now accepted them. Hitler felt that Christianity was the product of the Jews. St. Paul figured it out to bring to the Gentiles a notion of a God of mercy, a God of forgiveness, a God of tolerance in order to weaken the will of the Aryans. Jesus was portrayed not as a Jew, but now portrayed as an Aryan hero fighting the Jews. And this is part of the terrible story of the Holocaust. There was a qualitative difference between the anti-Semitism coming from religion and that coming from race. But that religious anti-Semitism had set the groundwork for what had actually happened. And Hitler had millions of very enthusiastic executioners. What a terrible time. All of us have to pray to God for God's mercy, that we could become merciful ourselves, that we could become embodiments of truth, warriors against superstition and prejudice, that we could become people who truly work for a better, more stable humanity. We have to be more charitable today than we were yesterday, more knowledgeable today than we were yesterday. We have to become more understanding today than we were yesterday. I've been in Jewish Christian studies for over 30 years now, and I've learned so much from the rabbis that I've talked with, shared with. And I think they may have learned a thing or two from me. But what we all know is that now is the time that people of faith in the one true, living, transcendent God should bind together with each other. In 2018, there were hundreds of churches and also synagogues vandalized, and some mosques as well. The forces of hell attack with great glee all of the religious institutions and their symbols. Now is the time for us to reverence one another, our faiths, and on our journey together, learn how to mutually build a more stable world. Shalom. May God be with you on your great journey.